The move was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of scraping by in their cramped city apartment, the Whitmore family finally had a chance to breathe. The new house stood tall at the end of a lonely cul-de-sac, surrounded by dense woods that whispered in the wind. Its faded white paint and cracked shutters hinted at its age, but to the Whitmores, it was perfect, an escape. "It's got character," Henry Whitmore said, running a hand along the warped wooden banister as his wife, Lisa, eyed the cobwebbed corners skeptically. "It's got work," she muttered, brushing a spider off her sleeve. Their teenage daughter, Emily, wandered upstairs, her footsteps creaking on the uneven floorboards. 8-year-old Tommy, clutching his stuffed rabbit, lingered by the doorway, staring at the dark woods beyond the yard. The first few days were uneventful, filled with unpacking and arguments about where the furniture should go. The house seemed eager to settle into its new life with them, groaning and sighing in the night like an old man stretching his limbs. It wasn't until the third night that things began to change. It started with the whispers. Faint at first, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Lisa heard them while she was in the kitchen, washing dishes. She turned off the faucet and listened, the hair on her arms standing on end. The sound seemed to come from the walls, a muffled murmur just beyond her reach. "Henry," she called, her voice trembling. Henry appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. "What's up? Do you hear that?" They both stood in silence, but the whispers had stopped. Henry shrugged. "Old house noises. You'll get used to it." But Lisa wasn't convinced. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Persistent. They seemed to crawl through the walls, seeping into her ears. She shook Henry awake. "There's something in the walls," she hissed. Henry groaned. "Lisa, it's probably mice or something. I'll check it out tomorrow." But it wasn't mice. The next day, while Henry was at work, Lisa decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured into the basement. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mold and earth. She swept the beam of light across the room, illuminating stacks of forgotten boxes and rusted tools. In the far corner, a wooden panel caught her eye. It didn't match the rest of the wall, as though it had been hastily nailed in place. Heart pounding, Lisa approached the panel. She pried it loose with a crowbar, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The whispers surged, louder and more urgent, echoing from the depths. She staggered back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Something moved in the shadows. A figure. Too tall, too thin, its limbs contorted unnaturally. Lisa screamed, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam slicing through the darkness. By the time Henry got home, the basement was empty, the panel nailed back into place. Lisa refused to go down there again. "You're imagining things," Henry said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the basement door. "Maybe we should call someone to check it out." That night, Emily came running into their room, tears streaming down her face. "There's someone in my closet," she sobbed. Henry sighed, dragging himself out of bed to reassure her. He opened the closet door, revealing only rows of hanging clothes and a pile of shoes. But as he closed it, he swore he saw something shift in the shadows. A flicker of movement, gone too fast to be certain. The next few days were a blur of escalating terror. Doors slammed shut on their own. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Tommy's stuffed rabbit disappeared, only to reappear in the attic, its button eyes torn off. Emily refused to sleep in her room, insisting that something watched her from the corners. One evening, as the family huddled in the living room, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to come from all around, filling the air with a sinister chorus. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. "Everyone stay close," Henry shouted, fumbling for his phone. The flashlight illuminated their terrified faces as they pressed together, listening to the whispers grow into guttural moans. The basement door creaked open. Lisa screamed as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the thing she had seen before, its twisted body illuminated in the pale beam of the flashlight. Its face was a hollow void, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Henry grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it wildly as the creature lunged toward them. The impact sent it staggering back, its limbs flailing like a broken marionette. "Run!" Henry shouted. The family bolted for the front door, yanking it open and spilling out into the cold night. They didn't stop running until they reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door and begging for help. When the police arrived, they found the house empty. No sign of the creature, no evidence of the whispers. But the basement panel was open, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. The officers refused to explore it, sealing it off instead. The Whitmores never went back. They moved into a cramped apartment in the city, vowing never to speak of the house again. But late at night, Lisa still hears the whispers. Faint and distant, as though carried on the wind. And she wonders if the house is calling them back. The house on Elm Hollow. It started with the smell. Faint at first, like damp earth and something faintly metallic, it lingered just below the threshold of notice. Clara dismissed it as the quirks of an old house. After all, she and her husband, Mark, had just purchased the place, a sprawling Victorian-era mansion tucked away in the secluded woods of Elm Hollow. It was supposed to be their dream home, a fresh start after years of city life. The first night passed uneventfully, though Clara awoke once to a faint tapping noise. She chalked it up to the wind against the windows. The second night was different. Mark was out late at a meeting, and Clara had settled into bed with a book when the tapping returned, louder this time, deliberate. It wasn't coming from the windows but from within the walls. Clara froze, her eyes darting to the ornate wallpaper, its floral patterns twisting grotesquely in the dim light. The tapping grew more insistent, rhythmic, like fingers drumming against hollow wood. Gathering her courage, she followed the sound down the hall to the attic door. She stood there, hand trembling on the doorknob, as the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence. When Mark returned, she told him about the noise. He laughed it off. "Old houses make weird sounds," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "It's probably just squirrels." But Clara couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The next morning, they decided to explore the attic. The air grew colder as they climbed the creaking stairs. The attic was vast and cluttered, filled with the detritus of previous owners, cracked trunks, moth-eaten clothes, and an old rocking chair that sat eerily in the center of the room. Mark moved to open a trunk while Clara wandered to the far corner, drawn by a strange sensation, like static in the air. She found a small, intricately carved box half buried under a pile of yellowed newspapers. The moment she touched it, a sharp chill ran through her, and she thought she heard a faint whisper. "Mark," she called, her voice shaking. "Look at this." Mark took the box, examining it closely. It had no hinges or seams, no obvious way to open it. Inscribed on its surface were strange symbols that neither of them recognized. "Probably just some old knick-knack," Mark said, though he seemed less certain now. That night, Clara dreamt of the house. In her dream, the walls pulsed like living flesh, and something unseen moved within them, whispering her name. She woke drenched in sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark lay beside her, sound asleep, but the box now sat on their nightstand, though she distinctly remembered leaving it in the attic. Over the next few days, the house's atmosphere grew heavier, oppressive. The smell intensified, and the tapping evolved into a scraping sound, as if something were trying to claw its way out. Objects moved on their own, a chair pulled back from the dining table, a door that refused to stay shut. Mark tried to rationalize it, but even he began to grow uneasy. Then came the voices. Clara heard them first, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, their tone pleading, desperate. Mark dismissed her claims until he heard them too, late one night while he worked in his study. The voices called his name, beckoning him toward the attic. "We need to leave," Clara said the next morning, her face pale and drawn. But Mark shook his head. "It's our house," he said. "We can't just run away." That evening, Mark decided to burn the box, convinced it was the source of their troubles. Clara watched nervously as he placed it in the fireplace and lit a match. The flames roared to life, unnaturally bright and hot, but the box remained unscathed. Instead, the house itself seemed to groan, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The groaning turned to a deafening roar, and the whispers became screams. Clara and Mark fled outside, but the moment they crossed the threshold, the noise stopped. The house stood silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching them. They spent the night in a motel, too terrified to return. The next morning, they contacted a local historian to learn more about the house. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. The house on Elm Hollow had been built in the late 1800s by a reclusive man named Elias Crowley, rumored to be involved in occult practices. According to local lore, Crowley had conducted rituals in the attic, attempting to commune with spirits. He disappeared without a trace, and every subsequent owner of the house had either vanished or fled, leaving the property abandoned for decades. Determined to end the nightmare, Clara and Mark returned one final time, armed with sage, holy water, and a priest willing to bless the house. As they stepped inside, the air grew icy, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The priest began his prayers, but the house fought back. Doors slammed, furniture toppled, and the whispers grew into an ear-splitting cacophony. The box, untouched in the fireplace, began to shake violently. Clara grabbed it, desperate to end the madness, and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, releasing a plume of black smoke that coalesced into a humanoid figure with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. The figure let out a bone-chilling scream before dissipating into the air. The house fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt light. Clara and Mark didn't wait to see if the peace would last. They packed their belongings and left, vowing never to return. The house on Elm Hollow still stands, its windows dark and uninviting. Some say it's empty, but others claim to see flickering lights and hear faint whispers at night. No one stays for long. And the smell? It lingers, faint but unmistakable, like damp earth and something metallic. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield of the moving truck as Sarah and Tom navigated the winding country road. It had been a grueling drive, made worse by the eerie darkness of the forest that seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. They had left the bustling city behind for a quieter life, purchasing a sprawling, albeit aged, house in a remote town called Black Hollow. The realtor had called it a hidden gem. Sarah, ever the optimist, had been enchanted by its old-world charm. Tom, however, couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest the moment he laid eyes on the property. As they pulled into the long gravel driveway, the house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and imposing against the stormy sky. It was a Victorian-era mansion, its once bright white paint now faded and peeling. The windows, many of which were dark and cracked, gave the impression of hollow, unblinking eyes. Despite its decrepit state, Sarah beamed. "It has so much potential," she said, clutching Tom's arm. Tom forced a smile, unwilling to dampen her excitement. "Let's just get everything inside before the rain gets worse," he said. Inside, the house was cold and musty, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. The floorboards creaked with every step, and their voices echoed unervingly in the cavernous space. The grand staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into shadows. Sarah's excitement didn't waver as she began exploring, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Tom set about unloading the truck, his discomfort growing with every trip back and forth. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He told himself it was just the isolation and the eerie atmosphere playing tricks on his mind. By the time the last box was inside, the rain had intensified, and night had fully fallen. After a quick dinner of takeout pizza, they decided to call it a night. The master bedroom was on the second floor, a cavernous space with a high ceiling and a fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in decades. As they climbed into bed, the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. Sarah drifted off quickly, her soft snores a comforting sound in the otherwise silent house. Tom, however, lay awake, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and writhe, and every creak of the old house set his nerves on edge. Just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above. "Sarah," he whispered, nudging her. She stirred but didn't wake. The tapping continued, growing louder. Tom's heart pounded as he slipped out of bed, grabbing his phone for light. He followed the sound to the attic door at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was now a steady drumming. Taking a deep breath, Tom pushed the door open. The narrow staircase leading up to the attic was shrouded in darkness. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity won out. He climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood amplifying his anxiety. The attic was freezing, the air thick with dust. His phone's flashlight illuminated piles of old furniture, trunks, and cobweb-covered knickknacks. The tapping had stopped. Tom scanned the room, his breath visible in the icy air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. Silence. Just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something strange, a large mirror leaning against the far wall. Its surface was grimy, but as he approached, he saw his reflection. Or at least, he thought it was his reflection. The figure in the mirror looked like him, but its movements didn't quite match his own. When Tom tilted his head, the reflection's head moved a fraction of a second later. His heart raced as he stepped closer. The reflection's lips curled into a sinister grin, even though Tom's mouth remained firmly shut. He stumbled back, tripping over a box and landing hard on the floor. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the figure stepped out, its movements jerky and unnatural. It towered over him, its face a grotesque parody of his own. Tom scrambled to his feet and bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving. The house was silent again, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, Sarah found him asleep on the couch in the living room. He hadn't told her what happened, convincing himself it had been a nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the unease lingered. As the days turned into weeks, strange occurrences became a regular part of their lives. Objects moved on their own. Footsteps echoed in empty halls. Doors slammed shut without warning. Sarah, ever pragmatic, dismissed these events as the quirks of an old house settling. But Tom knew better. One night, as they sat in the living room unpacking boxes, the lights flickered and went out. "Great," Sarah muttered, fumbling for her phone. Tom retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen and made his way to the basement to check the circuit breaker. The basement was damp and smelled of decay. The breaker box was on the far wall, and as Tom approached, the beam of his flashlight caught something on the floor, a series of strange symbols etched into the concrete. He crouched down, running his fingers over the markings. They were intricate, almost ritualistic. Before he could examine them further, a low growl echoed through the basement. He froze, his flashlight darting around the room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The growl came again, louder this time, and a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness. Tom backed away, tripping over a pipe and dropping the flashlight. In the chaos, he felt something cold and slimy brush against his leg. He scrambled to his feet and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind him. "What happened?" Sarah asked, alarmed by his pale face and trembling hands. I think we need to call someone," he stammered. "This house isn't right." Sarah sighed, frustration evident in her tone. "Tom, you're letting your imagination get the better of you. It's just an old house. We'll fix it up and make it our own." But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking within the walls. He began researching the history of the house, uncovering a chilling tale. The previous owners had vanished without a trace, leaving behind all their belongings. Before them, a family had died in a mysterious fire. The house had a dark reputation, and locals avoided it at all costs. One night, unable to sleep, Tom decided to confront whatever was tormenting them. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, he returned to the attic. The mirror was still there, its surface now pristine. As he approached, his reflection once again moved independently, grinning maliciously. This time, Tom didn't run. He raised the crowbar and swung it at the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the floor, the shards hovered in midair, spinning rapidly. A deafening roar filled the attic as a dark, shadowy figure emerged from the broken mirror. The figure lunged at Tom, its icy grip wrapping around his throat. He struggled, gasping for air, as the room seemed to collapse around him. Just when he thought he was going to die, a blinding light filled the attic, and the figure released him, retreating into the shadows. Sarah stood in the doorway, holding a large, ancient-looking book. She was chanting in a language Tom didn't recognize, her voice steady and commanding. The figure let out an ear-piercing scream before dissipating into the darkness. Tom collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping for breath. What just happened?" he managed to choke out. Sarah helped him to his feet, her face pale but determined. "I found this book in one of the boxes we brought up from the basement," she explained. "It's a grimoire. This house, it's a portal. That mirror was a gateway to something terrible." Together, they burned the mirror's remains and sealed the attic with salt and protective symbols from the grimoire. The activity in the house ceased, but the scars of their ordeal remained. They decided to sell the house and return to the city, leaving Black Hollow and its dark secrets behind. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the attic window, watching them leave. She blinked, and it was gone. Neither of them spoke as they disappeared down the winding road, the house fading into the mist. But deep down, they knew they would never truly escape its grasp. The house on Hollow Ridge. When Clara and Ethan moved into their new home on Hollow Ridge, they thought it was the beginning of a bright chapter in their lives. The house, a sprawling Victorian masterpiece built in the late 1800s, was everything they had ever dreamed of. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper, but they saw potential in the faded elegance, the towering gables, the intricate woodwork, and the wide porch that begged for a swing. The price was surprisingly low, but they chalked it up to the house's age and the extensive renovations it needed. "It's perfect," Clara said as they stepped inside for the first time, her voice echoing through the empty halls. Ethan agreed, though he couldn't shake the odd chill that ran down his spine as he crossed the threshold. Settling in. The first few weeks were uneventful. Clara and Ethan spent their days tearing down old wallpaper, sanding floors, and painting walls. At night, they'd collapse into bed, too exhausted to notice the house's creaks and groans. But as the renovations progressed, subtle, unsettling occurrences began to intrude on their idyllic plans. It started with the noises. Late at night, Clara would hear faint whispers, as though someone were murmuring just out of earshot. Ethan dismissed it as the wind or the house settling. But one night, as she lay in bed, she felt the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing against her ankle. She bolted upright, heart racing, but found nothing there. "You're just overtired," Ethan said when she told him the next morning. "This house is old. It's bound to play tricks on us." But Clara wasn't so sure. The locked room. While clearing out the attic one afternoon, Ethan discovered a door they hadn't noticed before. It was small and set into the far wall, partially obscured by stacks of old trunks and crates. The door was locked, and no key seemed to fit. "Probably just an old storage closet," Ethan said, brushing it off. But Clara felt an inexplicable unease every time she passed by it. She couldn't explain why, but the door felt wrong, as though something behind it was waiting. A week later, they hired a locksmith to open it. The man worked in silence, his brow furrowed as he fiddled with the ancient lock. When the door finally creaked open, a foul stench wafted out, making Clara gag. The room was tiny, no more than a few feet across, and completely empty. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved deep into the wood. In the center of the floor lay a small, dark stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "What the hell is this?" Ethan muttered, his voice tight. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the symbols, which seemed to writhe and twist the longer she looked at them. They hastily shut the door and decided to leave it alone. The shadows. After the door was opened, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew heavier, and the temperature seemed to drop no matter how high they set the thermostat. Shadows began to move in ways that defied logic. Clara would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, elongated forms that slithered across the walls and floors, even when there was no light source to cast them. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Clara saw a shadow dart across the hallway behind her. She turned quickly, but no one was there. Her breath quickened as she heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating up the stairs. "Ethan," she called out, her voice trembling. But he was in the backyard, repairing a broken fence. That night, Clara dreamed of the locked room. In her dream, the symbols on the walls glowed with an eerie red light, and a figure stood in the center of the room. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Ethan's discovery. Ethan, ever the skeptic, began to change after an encounter of his own. Late one night, he was in the basement working on rewiring the old fuse box when he heard a low growl. He froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The growl grew louder, more guttural, and seemed to come from the shadows pooling in the corner of the room. Suddenly, the light bulb overhead exploded, plunging the basement into darkness. Ethan scrambled up the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the top, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. He didn't tell Clara what had happened, but she noticed his growing unease. He started avoiding the basement altogether and became irritable, snapping at her over minor things. The tension between them grew, fed by the house's oppressive presence. The stranger. One rainy afternoon, a knock at the door startled Clara. She opened it to find an elderly woman standing on the porch, her eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave this place," the woman said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." Clara frowned. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "My name is Margaret," the woman said. "I lived here as a child. My family left after my brother disappeared. The house is cursed. You must get out before it's too late." Clara's stomach twisted. "What do you mean, cursed?" Margaret hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being watched. "There's something in this house. Something evil. My brother used to hear it whispering to him. He said it wanted to play. Then one night, he went into the locked room, and we never saw him again." Before Clara could ask more, Margaret turned and hurried away, disappearing into the rain. The entity. That night, Clara and Ethan decided to confront whatever was tormenting them. Armed with flashlights and a sense of desperate determination, they went to the locked room. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly as they stepped inside, and the air was thick with an unbearable stench. As they stood in the center of the room, the door slammed shut behind them. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners began to coalesce, forming a towering figure. Its face was featureless, but its presence radiated malevolence. "Why are you here?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The entity didn't answer with words. Instead, it extended a long, shadowy arm, pointing toward the stain on the floor. The room filled with a cacophony of whispers, each voice more frantic and desperate than the last. Ethan grabbed Clara's hand. "We need to get out of here." But the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until they suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, a single, guttural voice spoke. "Stay. Escape." In a surge of adrenaline, Ethan threw his weight against the door, and it finally gave way. They stumbled out, slamming it shut behind them. The house seemed to shudder, as though enraged by their escape. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they packed their belongings and left at dawn, abandoning the house and everything they had worked for. Epilogue. Weeks later, Clara searched online for any information about the house. She found an old newspaper article about a family who had lived there in the 1940s. Their youngest son had vanished without a trace, and the family had moved away shortly after. Other accounts mentioned strange occurrences and tragedies that befell those who lived there. The house on Hollow Ridge still stands, its windows dark and empty. Occasionally, passers-by claim to hear whispers or see shadows moving inside. But no one dares to stay for long. The house waits, patient and hungry, for its next occupants.